Great. So we're now welcoming Rachel Davies from the Royal Veterinary College, who's giving a short talk on factors impacting the engagement and achievement of adult learners involved in a hybrid online teacher in veterinary education. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we couldn't hear much of Oscar's talk, and it sounded like it was incredibly relevant to what we'll be discussing here. So I apologize in advance if I miss some of those connections. One of the last questions was actually about what happens with students who can then choose to be online. And serendipitously, that's exactly what this talk is about. So I'm delighted to be here talking to you with my colleague Kirsty, and Liz, who isn't with us today. And we want to talk about factors impacting engagement and achievement in adult learners enrolled in a postgraduate certificate in veterinary education. During COVID, we moved our hybrid cohort onto our fully online course, and were therefore able to look at engagement and achievement and any differences there might be in students who had chosen to be online and those who had been moved online by us unceremoniously during COVID. What we did was invite students to interview them over Zoom. We transcribed the recordings in a free software called Otter AI, which I strongly suggest you go and use if you haven't already. We used NVivo for our coding, and delightfully, we were able to socially distance and meet in various public houses in Hertfordshire to do our thematic analysis together. So that's a COVID silver lining right there. If you want more detail, please see our abstract, and also hopefully in the near future we'll be publishing this research so you can read more about it there. What we found was that learner preferences were complex and dynamic. So those who had chosen to be online reported that actually if a veterinary education course had been nearby, they would have loved to have joined one. And those who were moved online, some students really appreciated that move because they were able to ring fence the time that had been given up to the face-to-face workshops for themselves, for their study and for other things. But other students really struggled with that. So their workplace took away that dedicated time and space, and they only got an hour to come to our webinars. They also were a group of students that came from a vocational background, so tended to be our veterinary nurses who had learned with their teams and in their teams, and therefore found it really difficult and frustrating to come into an online environment in spite of the webinars and other opportunities for meeting up that we had in place. Learner priorities were very similar. They were highly driven. Our students are highly driven and motivated, vets, vet nurses, physios, research scientists, and they were there to continue to improve their knowledge and skills as veterinary educators. Some of our students were self-funding and others were funded by their institutions, and there was much more of a drive to get a qualification and or get through probation. And this really mattered when it came to challenge, because they would then feel frustrated with their employers rather than potentially looking more inwardly as to how they might overcome those challenges. Similar to Kahu, we found that there were a number of, and similar also to Oscar, I did manage to catch the end of Oscar's talk, there were a number of structural, psychosocial and sociocultural influences that either facilitated or impeded engagement and achievement. And I just want to draw to your attention the workplace. This was a new thing for us because suddenly all of our students were studying online, and it helped us realize that the workplace was a really important factor. Their study time wasn't with us, it was in their own workplace, and they were trying to apply their new learning in their work, not with us. And so that had a really big difference into whether or not they could ring fence time for learning, whether that was protected and whether that was valued by their employers, but also whether they could make changes to their practice as educators. So the kinds of changes we saw were around things like bringing in constructive alignment, changes to feedback policies and procedures, bringing in reflective practice, although they would have sworn they hated reflective practice, and also changes to the way that they understood their learners and their needs. So they had a toolkit which they could use once they realized there were issues. The thing we were really pleased about is it changed their dialogue with their students, with their colleagues and with their line managers. They were having more informed, more authoritative conversations about the practice of teaching and learning, which was a big change as a result of being on the programme. And we were really pleased about that because our learners tend to have a real strong identity around being a clinician or being a research scientist, but being with us, all of the learners, however they engaged, were able to really work on their identity as an educator, which was an important step. There were a number of barriers, and Oscar's mentioned them in his talk, some controllable, some unavoidable. But as I said, the students that really struggled were those who were working in clinical environments. It was during COVID, we were experiencing a puppy boom, shifts were here, there and everywhere, and finding time and space for study was almost impossible. And also being able to go and make changes, so use their learning in their own setting. For some students, depending on the culture of their own university or their own workplace, they were not given that agency, and that made things quite frustrating for them. We also had a massive shift because they were used to learning clinical veterinary medicine or veterinary nursing and science, and we were asking them to engage in reflective practice, and that was a seismic shift for them. So a lot of our energy and their energy went into changing the way they thought about learning and the world that they lived in. So it's a great change, but it takes a lot of time and energy, and was certainly frustrating for many of the people studying with us. What we noticed right across the board is that rather than drop out, we do have dropouts at the beginning of our programme, but the people who don't drop out at the beginning tend to stay. And it is slightly worrying for us because they were telling us stories of extreme stress and extreme challenge. These are people who are putting professional and academic progress above their own well-being. And that's an issue for us because they're our students. They're also our staff and your staff. These are educators out in the world. And also they're the role models for our students. And I don't know if you know that the veterinary profession is going through a bit of a crisis in terms of well-being, and working with our veterinary educators could be a place that we could put some effort to really support that. So as a summary take home, we're really interested in engaging with employers because the workplace seems to be where we can get some leverage in creating protected time and place for study, and also giving agency for our learners to apply what they've learned in their own context. We are all about flexible learning, and we provide differentiation, but we need to do that right through our programme, not just at induction or at crunch points like exams and assessments. And finally, we are the role models. So as educators of educators, we have realised that we are role modelling self-regulation around our own personal and professional development, and therefore we are really careful about what we're role modelling for our students. And also that we can constructively align messages around well-being, so making some specific learning objectives around that should make a big difference to our students, those educators on our courses who are so important to us. I'd like to finish by thanking Code for funding this research, to RIDE, all of you here for listening and giving us this opportunity, and hand over to all of you and see if you have any questions.
That's great, thanks so much. I'll start with a question, if that's okay, if you can hear me okay. I wondered, you talk about students being directed to complete the course by their employers. I just wondered what the impact that was on student engagement. Can you give more information on that?
It didn't really come to the fore until things became challenging. So I think everyone was quite accepting that they needed to do this as part of their probation, for example. But when things got tough, and if the employers weren't providing time and space for them to dedicate to study, then there was a real tension and a real frustration, and students dropping off in engagement because they felt as if the employers were not backing them up and supporting them in that endeavour.
We just got linked to that. I mean, how important was the social, kind of formally or informally? You mentioned kind of one of your slides, you kind of academic kind of versus social. So I just wondered if that was a factor, or because it was online, it was something which you weren't kind of hugely familiar with in relation to these cohorts.
I'm just hoping that I understand your question. So,
Well, I just wondered if you've obviously in terms of kind of engagement, often we talk about academic engagement and kind of social engagement.
yeah. Yeah, so it really varied. Students all took their own path, and some students really were into academic sort of that co-construction of knowledge and understanding, and others really loved and missed the opportunity to have a bit of a jolly with their mates. And they saw that as a perk of being on this kind of program. And so when it went online, some of that real social, informal stuff went, and we kept in the academic social learning opportunities. What we now do is we've brought in socials and cafes. So we create space for those who just want to drop in and have a coffee and chat with themselves. And sometimes we drop in, and then we have dedicated, here's where we're going to really do an overview of some of the content and concepts. And then here's one where we're going to look at evidence to practice. So we're much more careful about providing those kind of differentiated opportunities for social versus academic interactions.
Thank you.
Sorry, this is Kirsty. I'm just coming in on some of the questions, and Rachel's been really articulate with the answers. But yeah, I think it does carry quite an important message kind of for online educators, the opportunities for social learning as being really important, and kind of scaffolding them in so that the participation for the students is really inclusive, and that they feel that they're able to foster that belongingness and foster those social connections. But yeah.
But they all do it differently. So I think what we realized is there's no one size fits all here. No. We just need to offer those opportunities up and be quite flexible and responsive. We talk much more with our students about what they might want. And we've realized that we have certain groups. So as I said, the vocational learners, the learners who've come through a nursing route, do want more opportunities to talk with other nurses. But equally, we want to mix people up so that nurses are talking with veterinary clinicians, with physiotherapists, with bench scientists, and that also we can have a lovely mix of our international versus UK or and etc.
Do we have any questions from the room? I have one more question. I just wondered how aware the tutors were of the kind of online by choice versus necessity. Did it impact, is it course structure, course delivery, ways of engaging students, or was it kind of in the background?
Sorry, the tutors?
Yeah, the tutors. So were they aware of that kind of dynamic of online by choice versus online by necessity? Did it impact course structure, delivery, ways of engaging students, or was it something that was very much in the background?
It was something that we had to learn as we went. Because of COVID, we were suddenly bringing these two in together, and we had a lot of insight that if we'd have thought about it before, we could have looked into, but we really were flying by the seat of our pants. It was great that we had this course that we could bring everyone into, but obviously, as you say, we were bringing in quite a different cohort of learners. When we actually first started, we tried to keep them separate because we felt that they would be, it would be good, and they would want these two separate groups, but we quite quickly realized that actually they were better off together, and where we thought the differences were in the cohorts weren't actually there. So now everybody's in together. We haven't gone back to hybrid learning. We're fully online, and we're just engaging all of our energy in being as flexible and responsive as we can to those learners as they move through. We're all that's the great thing about this research. It's because it's actually great for the team. We're able to go back and report back to our team and then make changes as we go. We're a small team, and therefore we're always talking and always making those changes. So yeah, I think we're quite lucky in that regard.
Thank you. Okay then, thank you very much, Rachel and Kirsty, and the appreciation.